Okay. Distinguished panelists and dear participants, very good afternoon. Welcome to the NICE webinar on US-China rivalry, middle powers, and the future of Indo-Pacific security. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Today we have very excellent scholars to talk on very interesting topic of today. Each speaker will be given 20 to 25 minutes to make the initial remarks, followed by questions. The audience can drop their questions in the Zoom room or comment below the Facebook Live. First, we have Dr. Pichamon Yeophantong. She will be talking on utility of the Indo-Pacific concept vis-a-vis China and regional tensions in the age of COVID-19. I got to meet her for the first time in Shanghai, and now we're meeting virtually, which is a very different situation. Dr. Pichamon is an Australian Research Council Fellow and Senior Lecturer in the School of Humanities and Social Science, Canberra, University of South Wales, Canberra, at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Previously, she was a Global Leader Fellow at University College, Oxford University, and Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance, Princeton University, as well as ASEAN-Canada Senior Fellow at the RSIS Centre for Non-Traditional Security Studies, Nanyang Technological University. She has conducted extensive fieldwork in China and Southeast Asia, having also served as a consultant to the Africa Progress Panel and Overseas Development Institute, among others. Her work on Chinese foreign policy and geoeconomic strategy has appeared in such publications as Pacific Affairs, Asian Survey, Chinese Journal of International Politics, and Water International. She is also a recipient of the Council of the Humanities, Art and Social Science Australia Future Leader Prize. Pichamon completed her PhD in Politics and International Relations at the National University, Australian National University, as an inaugural China Institute scholar. Thank you, Dr. Pichamon, for your time. Please, the floor is yours. Please try to make your presentation in 20-25 minutes.
Sure. Thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction, Pramod. And I will try to be as succinct as possible. But if I do speak for too long, please feel free to just stop me. I also apologize that you might see my couch pop up occasionally. So please do try and ignore that if you're able. Allow me to share my screen with everyone and make it big. So hopefully everyone can see my screen now. For my section of today's panel, I wanted to talk about, well, China, but also the situation in terms of great power rivalry and the future of Indo-Pacific security and the utility of the idea of the Indo-Pacific concept during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think I'll go through this very quickly, given that I believe most people on this call will be aware of the current geopolitical dynamics within the region, but also China's internal dynamics as well as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in terms of geopolitics, of course, we've been witnessing what many are now calling the weaponization of the pandemic by both the US and China, which in turn has stimulated or instigated these new China threat fears, especially in the West. A lot of these fears have centered on concerns that China, or Beijing rather, is trying to undertake a misinformation or disruption campaign globally, but has also coincided with claims of Chinese bullying when it comes to key issues like the South China Sea dispute or the border dispute with India, for example. At the same time, we've seen Beijing trying to counteract many of these concerns and fears by starting its own kind of PR, public relations campaign. And we've seen this through the whole mass diplomacy idea, as well as the rebranding, or not so much rebranding, but the additional branding of the Belt and Road Initiative as a health Silk Road initiative as well. At the same time, when we think in terms of the economic security nexus, we've also heard a lot of calls for the strategic decoupling, especially in terms of the supply chain disruptions that COVID-19 has caused, as well as concerns over the debt unsustainability. So in specifically concerns over the unsustainability of Chinese the debt caused by Chinese concessional loans in various parts of the world, but especially in developing countries. And certainly there would appear to be credence to these concerns, right? If we consider the fact that China accounts for 18% of the global trade in parts and components, the fact that China is a dominant actor, or rather Chinese companies are dominant actors within global supply chains, is something that really spotlights the need for supply chains to not be overly reliant on a single market. At the same time, debt unsustainability is a much broader issue, but certainly if we look at the COVID-19's impacts on the ability of developing countries to pay back the loans and all that, it's clearly a real concern. And even though Beijing has announced that it will extend, kind of not completely forgive, but at least kind of allow for some flexibility in terms of countries' ability to pay back those debt, it still is very unclear as to what that actually means in practice. So in light of this, it's also important to take into consideration the domestic situation for Beijing, for China as well. Clearly, Beijing has become increasingly concerned about the pandemic's impact on the Chinese Communist Party's ruling legitimacy and the broader implications for domestic stability, and of course, for China's global reputation as well. And I think what we're seeing, not least from the whole wolf warriors on Twitter and elsewhere, is the kind of the emerging siege mentality, a new siege mentality that's taking root, whereby Beijing feel like it is being, in one sense, cornered, especially by countries like the US, if not, and Australia to a certain extent. And this does not bode well, and I'll try and speak to why this is a concern later on. But a siege mentality, generally speaking, has never been productive, and it only promotes not just isolationism, but also a dangerous kind of reactive element in Chinese foreign policy. At the same time, currently Beijing's concern really centers on economic recovery. We now know that the Chinese economy is dealing with the issue of domestic debt, but of course, the need to revitalize key sectors like the manufacturing sector in China is also extremely important in terms of the country's longer-term ability to weather the storm from COVID-19. At the same time, needless to say, the problem with Hong Kong and other territorial and human rights issues also continue to play a major role in not just Beijing's domestic policy making, but also in its foreign policy outlook, in the sense that, in one sense, Beijing, with all of these problems happening at the same time, I think it's the case that Beijing is feeling not just cornered, but it can feel overly sensitive in terms of what each of these issues, how it can impact Beijing's freedom to maneuver, but also its ability to maintain its control domestically and internationally. So with all of these dynamics happening at the same time, we can see how Beijing's actions have appeared to become more assertive, as some would say, or even aggressive. And certainly there's plenty of ideological concerns being raised, especially by the US, as well as in Australia, about whether or not China's existing governing system, it being an authoritarian or one-party state, is something that also poses as a risk to the international order and the regional order. But so it brings us to the question of whether or not we should be alarmed by Beijing's actions and its current foreign policy discourse and behaviors. And I think the important thing to remember here is that Chinese assertiveness, the assertiveness that we're currently seeing really is, I would argue, a kind of a business as usual. Even when we talk about the South China Sea, for example, we might view there being more Chinese assertiveness from not just the island building, but also the rhetoric that's coming through. However, I think for many people who have been studying the South China Sea for a while, the general consensus is that Beijing is pursuing a line of action that more or less corresponds with what most people expect to see. The issue, however, is an issue of timing. It's also an issue of symbolism and the political frame that's being used by other countries to characterize what China is doing. So if you consider another example, which is what has been debated in Australia. So earlier in the year, China decided to impose tariffs on Australian barley, which was very controversial and was seen as a retaliation to Australia's decision to raise the issue of an international inquiry on the origins of COVID-19. And while there may be some truth to that in the sense that the timing of Beijing's decision very much coincided with the Australian call for an international inquiry, it is actually the case that the barley tariffs stem from a much more long-standing anti-dumping dispute between Beijing and Canberra. So in that regard, it's not really about COVID-19 Australia's alignment with the US per se, but it's actually has a little bit more to do with the fact that these are disputes that have been around for a much longer period. And the other question that links to that previous question about whether or not we should be alarmed by Chinese assertiveness is, of course, the question of whether then China is a threat. And of course, back in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion around the question of, is China a threat, or is it a peaceful actor, is it a revisionist, or is it a status quo actor? And it's quite interesting how these debates have now resurfaced again. I think the answer to the question of whether China is a threat is not a simple one. In one sense, we need to break down what the word threat itself means, but also acknowledge the fact that China militarily is not a threat in a traditional military sense, but it is certainly a threat. And I would use scare quotes here, if we were to consider its technological and economic prowess and the fact that it does constitute a peer competitor to the United States in those two domains. But whether or not it then constitutes a threat to the rest of the international community, and especially the community within the Indo-Pacific region, I think is a slightly different question. So there are three, relating to my response to those questions, I would put forward 3 points. The first one being that I think at this stage we need to be cognizant of the fact that tensions with China, not just between the US and China, but also with other countries like India and China or Australia and China, will now become a persistent feature of the regional, if not global order. Secondly, that the US can no longer be relied upon as a regional security guarantor in the Indo-Pacific. And thirdly, that there is a need for a new regional architecture to mitigate and control the risks and repercussions of conflict and tensions resulting from countries' bilateral relationships with China. And to be fair, these are the kind of the regional architecture is not something that can be built in one day. And one might be tempted to ask, you know, is it the case that new architecture can actually be built? And I think this is an important question, but it also requires a degree of optimism, which currently does not really exist. But nonetheless, I'd like for us to kind of reflect on this and kind of discuss potentially in the Q&A. But one quote that I did want to direct people to, if people haven't come across it already, is one from Lee Hsien Loong, the current Singaporean Prime Minister, who said that Asian countries see the US as a resident power that has vital interests in the region, Asia-Pacific region. At the same time, China is a reality on the doorstep. And the reason why I really like this quote is the fact that it does speak to the current dynamics, the current realities that we see in the Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. And it comes back to my earlier point about how the US can no longer be relied upon as a regional security guarantor in the Indo-Pacific. I think the one thing that has become extremely clear is the fact that countries in the region are very unwilling and are unable to choose between the US and China. And if they had to choose, the outcome may not be to the US's own interests as well. But more importantly, though, is the fact that there is no real choice or decision to be made. So for that reason, the US's current strategy of trying to push countries to make a decision between China and the US, but also to try and kind of push Beijing into a corner is most likely going to be counterproductive in the long term. And at the same time, the fact that the US does not seem to have a comprehensive strategy to deal with the blowback is also worrying. And I think that lack of a comprehensive strategy is also becoming all the clearer to states in the region as well, and only further reinforces the fact that the post-COVID-19 world is going to be one that is no longer US-centric, but one that will necessarily become more Asia-centric and more multilateral or multiplexes, to use the words of Amitav Acharya. At the same time, coming back to my first point about the fact that tensions with China will remain a persistent feature, I think this also brings it brings to light the fact that China is revisionist, but it's not surprising that it's revisionist. And for some reason, a lot of the commentary that we see at the moment tends to treat this as something that's surprising. Like, to say that China is a revisionist power seems to be something that's shocking or unexpected. And yet, as a rising power, this is something that we should have expected for a long time, since a long time ago. And so for China to be kind of demonstrating its global and regional ambitions in a much clearer way now, with the Belt and Road Initiative and other initiatives on the side, shouldn't be catching us off guard. And what it does mean, however, is that we need, again, that regional architecture to help manage those ambitions, to also ensure that they result in cooperation and good outcomes that benefit the collective, right? So coming back to my third point, whether or not this regional architecture then currently exists, I think the answer is quite simple. And the answer is that currently, I don't believe that we have such a regional architecture, hence the reason why I said we needed new regional architecture. And this is because if you look at ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, there are limits to ASEAN in the sense that if you look at the ASEAN way, the fact that it's very consultative, the fact that it is consensus-based means that in many respects, there are very real constraints in how far our ASEAN is able to go within its institutional framework to mitigate conflicts and disputes, but also to, in one sense, impose certain rules on its member states. At the same time, if you look at the limits, if you look at the quadrilateral security dialogue, you'll also see that the Quad itself also faces a number of limitations, not least the fact that it still remains in many respects rather informal, and the insistence on it remaining a kind of an alignment but not an alliance, I think also creates the problem of it not having a formal framework in place, but also the fact that as a result, it becomes very malleable. And we can see this already through the varied definitions of what the Quad ought to do as advanced by its different members, i.e. Australia, the US, Japan, and India. And now with the so-called expansion of the Quad to include 3 other countries, Vietnam, New Zealand, and South Korea, I think it's also the case that the Quad Plus mechanism, as it's now called, also faces very similar limitations. At the same time, because the Quad carries the connotations of it being a counter initiative to China, also means that Quad Plus members would be less willing, I think, to be grouped into to endorse a very anti-China policy in that regard. So given that South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand have all maintained close economic relations with Beijing, but also the fact that it doesn't, again, in the long term, jeopardizing those economic relationships would be very costly in real terms to those countries. If we look at the Indo-Pacific concept, and at one point there was a lot of faith in this concept, there was a lot of, especially in Australia, there was a real belief that it could actually lead to a new security arrangement, if not a new regional order altogether. There are also very clear constraints. The Indo-Pacific concept itself is, like the Quad, rather malleable. And if we look at how it's been defined by different actors, it has changed. So if you look at, for India, the focus is on inclusivity, whereas for Japan and the US, the focus is on the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. Similarly, if you look to Indonesia's understanding of the concept, they're now trying to put forward their own Indo-Pacific cooperation concept, almost as one could say, an addition to or an alternative to the Indo-Pacific concept as originally put forward by Japan and the US. So given the variation in understanding that we see here, it makes it very difficult to really ascertain what the Indo-Pacific concept as a strategic concept is about, but how it can then serve as a roadmap or a blueprint for new regional security architecture also becomes rather questionable in consequence. It's also, I think, quite interesting to note the fact that Japan has slightly amended its definition of the Indo-Pacific concept as well, previously viewing it, of course, as a strategy in the same vein as the United States, but now rebranding it more as a vision. So what the practical implications are of that is something that remains to be seen. But again, I think it underscores the point that as a concept or as a strategy, the Indo-Pacific is not as clear-cut as it ought to be in order for it to be useful as a roadmap or a blueprint for a new regional security architecture. At the same time, I think if I can come back to the Quad a little bit, there's a lot of talk now that the Quad Plus signals how the Quad itself might go back to its original roots as being more focused on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief coordination. And I think whilst that focus is certainly important, especially during these times with COVID-19, I do think that if that were to be the case, it would also further undermine the Quad's identity as a potential security arrangement and its ability to then put forward mechanisms that can help to maintain the great power rivalry that we now see underway between the US and China. So on that note, I think what the important question is, what does this all mean? I mean, I started out with the question that we need a new regional security architecture, and I think people might be asking, well, can you come up with one, or can you at least suggest what that regional architecture might look like? And I think it's beyond the ability of one scholar to do so. However, I'll be more than happy to discuss this in the Q&A with everyone. But I think in terms of the immediate next steps, or what needs to happen now in light of not just COVID-19, but also the intensification of the ideological rivalry between the US and China, but also with other countries, again, like Australia, is the fact that we need to see the strengthening of multilateralism and of multilateral institutions, which is something that I believe Beijing will find difficult to dispute, given the fact that Beijing has constantly spoken to the importance of multilateralism, has often spoken about the need to democratize the international system in order to allow for greater diversity in the system as well. And this is even more important given the fact that US President Donald Trump has clearly is really doubling down on his whole US exemptionalism idea, as seen from the fact that the US will now definitely withdraw from the World Health Organization and so forth. At the same time, I think the idea of the Indo-Pacific, if we want to use it as a cornerstone or as a conceptual anchor for future regional security arrangements, I think it's a concept that is better advanced by middle powers and not the United States itself, because again, it'll be better for the concept not to have the kind of the anti-China overtones. And I'm using anti-China in a very generalized way here, but I think most people on the call will appreciate that there's nuance to that usage. But even then, there are limits to its effectiveness, again, given the fact that the Indo-Pacific concept has been defined in various ways by different actors. So really, the step towards kind of really consolidating this concept would be for countries to first come up with a collective understanding. And I think ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific serves as a one step towards that. And I think we need to see more of that if we want it to become a real thing, so to speak. At the same time, I think there's a need to amplify the necessity and the importance of playing the politics of restraint. Oftentimes in world affairs, we see kind of a glorification of power politics, in the sense that if you can play power politics well, you're more likely to succeed in a very competitive international arena. But I think in a post-COVID-19 world, the politics of restraint will be the true marker of a successful state and of successful statecraft as well. And I think for most countries, not just the US and China, being able to demonstrate restraint and pursue cooperation will become the lasting legacies that determine not just the international or regional orders, but also determine their success, to put it that way, in the international arena. Finally, I think we need to really focus on regional economic integration. And there have been studies that have been released by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. They did some modeling to demonstrate how Asia currently is converging into a more coherent economic entity as a result of RSET, or the regional economic regional cooperation. Oh, sorry.
I think is the word you're looking for.
Sorry, can you say that again? I'm blanking. Partnership, thank you very much, that's right. And the CPTPP as well. So I think the modeling said that with those two, we will see greater economic integration within the region, and that this will also help to relieve an over-reliance on a single market, i.e. China, in the post-COVID-19 world. Currently, the US and India aren't part of either initiatives, which can result in longer-term economic losses for either country. But I think the message there really is that these economic integration initiatives, despite their shortcomings in different aspects, are still central to kind of crafting that common identity, that common vision in a post-COVID-19 world, and also to strengthening cooperation within the region and helping countries not to take sides, but to maintain their pragmatism amidst great power rivalry and the challenges that the longer term challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic is posing to states. So on that note, I'll stop there. And again, I look forward to your questions and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pichamon. It was a very interesting presentation. The next speaker is Dr. Jaikon Lai. Dr. Jaikon Lai is an assistant professor in the International Political Economy program of S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. Jaikon's research interests lie at the intersection of international and comparative political economies and international relations. His work examines how state, business, and societal actors create, reproduce, and sustain finance and financial sector. Dr. Lai's research output has been published in Review of International Political Economy, New Political Economy, Journal of the Asia-Pacific Economy, Asia-Europe Journal, and the Australian Journal of Public Administration. He's also author of a book, Financial Crisis and Institutional Changes in East Asia, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. He also contributes to wider popular debates among various commentary pieces. He received his doctorate degree from the Department of International Relations in the College of Asia and the Pacific in the Australian National University. He has previously studied at the College of Oxford, where he obtained an MPhil in International Relations and the London School of Economics and Political Science, finishing with a BSc in Economics, first class. Dr. Lai, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Pramod, and thank you for inviting me to speak to the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, and to everyone who is tuned in Nepal and elsewhere. I thought what I'd do today is pull together my observations of China-US rivalry from a political economic perspective, and try and make some sense of what I've been observing in the last couple of years, right? So what I'll do now is I'll try and share my slides with you. All right. Oh, wait, hang on. Oh, it looks like I can't do that without quitting Zoom.
I think you can do that. You can share.
Let me try again. Oh, yes, it will work. Yes, you're right. Okay, thank you. So that's now this, I think, so I guess my starting point is that this China-US rivalry, the most recent manifestation of this is Trump's trade war, which, I'm sure many of us have been observing since about, when it began in about 2018, when Trump was elected president of the United States. But it's worth noting that this competition between US and China has got long secular roots. And one way of looking at this is look at this long-term decline, secular decline in US share of world GDP, and conversely, the long-term rise in China's share of world GDP. So this slide, which I constructed from data that I had extracted from the World Bank, will show you in this green line here, the US share of world GDP, right? So it's sort of, you might, one could say that it's pretty much constant, but it's sort of come down by about 2 or 3%. The more significant decline is actually this red line, which is the share of the European Union's GDP, of world GDP. So this has come down quite a bit more. But obviously the indicator that's of most interest to us is the rise of China in the share of world GDP. So that's come up quite a lot since 1980. So I use 1980 as a starting point because that sort of marked the beginning, some of the early years of China's reintegration with global economy following Deng Xiaoping's reopening of China's economic borders. Another way to look at this competition is look at the trade balance for the United States. And so if you look at the next slide here, this one's looks a bit more complicated, but what we're looking at here is the blue line shows the trade deficit that the US has with the entire world. So that's basically the amount of goods that the US has been buying from the rest of the world in excess of what it's selling. So basically it's buying more from the rest of the world than it is selling to the rest of the world. And this has climbed over the years. So the data began in 1987. This, by the way, is obtained from the US Census Bureau, so it's American data. And it's effectively it's been climbing over this period here. The only dip was in 2008, following the global financial crisis, or the transatlantic financial crisis, where America was one of the key nodes. Now, the red line is the trade deficit that the US has vis-a-vis China. So meaning the red line shows how much more the US is buying from China versus how much it's selling to China. And this too, as everyone now knows, has been rising. And this share has also been rising over time. So this sort of explains to us, both this slide and the previous slide, explains to us US preoccupation with the rise of China, and why this competition has over time become more and more salient, at least from when you look at the material foundations of that competition. It's 5 o'clock. So looking at what both US and China has been doing in the last 3 years, I kind of summarize this by saying that the rivalry has 3 economic fronts. There is the trade front, a finance front, and the third one, which at the moment I'm sort of loosely calling firms or business front, right? So the trade front, most of you will be familiar with. So this is the trade war that Trump started with China in 2018. And the source of this is the argument that the US makes that the competition with China is not fair, right? There's no level playing field. And in particular, I think there are 2 main issues. One is the accusation that China, or Chinese government and Chinese firms, either force the transfer of intellectual property from foreign firms to Chinese firms, or worse, that they steal this intellectual property. That's one of the main allegations. The second is that because of the nature of Chinese capitalism, it is argued that many Chinese firms have not just links with government, but also receive considerable economic benefits from government, which enable them to sell goods at highly competitive prices in the global market. So this is an unfair advantage that Chinese firms allegedly have in the global market, and this puts them, makes American products less competitive, it is argued. And then finally, that some of the other complaints have been about market access, in part because Chinese markets tend to be more closed and highly regulated, and so it is usually quite difficult for foreigners to penetrate. So these are some of the main issues, and I think I won't rehearse what's gone on, but it's, for the moment, I'll just note that, I think you all know that US and China had agreed on this phase 1 deal earlier this year, before the pandemic took over, all news reports. So according to that deal, by the end of 2020, China needs to have bought about this many goods from the US. There are 2 lines here. For the purpose of this conversation, we can ignore them, but really one line is how much China should be buying if you're looking at the statistics from China's perspective, or how much China should be buying if you're looking at the statistics from the US perspective. But, and this is because, the way national statistics are collected, sometimes there are discrepancies. But for the purpose of our conversation, this difference between the red and blue line doesn't really matter. The main issue is the difference between this dotted line and this line at the bottom. These lines at the bottom is how much China actually has bought from the US since the beginning of the year. And we can see that there's a huge gap between the two. So there is already now in the US some concern that China is never going to meet the goal being here, right, at the end of the year. And there are a number of explanations that have been proffered as to why they're not closer to this dotted line. One, the obvious one is that the world has gone through this coronavirus crisis. The global economy has been severely depressed in recent months. So obviously, you can't be expecting China to be buying as much from the US. The second argument that is slightly more sophisticated is that, well, in actual fact, Chinese purchases from the US is not, monotonic like this. It's not even every single month of the year, but rather it's seasonal, and that most of the purchases would be expected to be had, around the third quarter of the year. So you might see a spike later in the year. And so if you were forgiving, you'd say, well, the jury's still out. The third possible argument is that, well, maybe China's not being, being a good guy here, right? So that, they don't really have any intention of fulfilling their agreement. And so what we're seeing now is just that they're holding back at the moment. So this is potentially, I guess, a flashpoint further down the track as in the year. So I think I'll stop the share here because that's all the slides I have. So I'll move on now to the second front of this competition between the United States and China. And this is on the financial front. And here the US has been using its leverage in the global financial system. And this leverage, and the US has this leverage for two reasons. One is that the US dollar is a considerable, wait, let me rephrase that. The US dollar is used in about 2/3 of all transactions that are conducted at the global level. And as a result, it gives the US government and American because whenever you want to try and convert your US dollar back into, say, your local currency, and so in this case, from, if a Chinese exporter wants to sell, it sells goods to the US, it normally will collect payment in US dollar, and then it will want to convert that, or at least some of that, back to Chinese renminbi, so that it can pay its workers and its raw materials. That conversion normally has to take place through, at some point along the way through an American bank. And so the US has considerable leverage in this system. So if it doesn't like, a particular individual or a particular country, it could instruct its financial institutions not to conduct business with, a particular actor, and therefore, stuff up your, what you would intend to do. And so the example at the moment that is actually happening is Iran. So, Iran faces a number of sanctions, and US financial institutions have been instructed not to conduct any business with Iran. And one of the side effects of this was that in the process of all this happening, HSBC, which is a British bank based in Hong Kong, has been caught out conducting business on behalf, or allegedly conducting business on behalf of Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications firm. And this was the immediate cause for why Huawei's chief financial officer was detained and held in Canada. So this lady, Wang Mingzhou. So that's one of the ways in which this is happening. But also more recently, in the last couple of months, we've seen the US amped up its use or its leverage in the global financial system to target Chinese actors more directly. One is that there is this Federal Retirement Board, investment board, that has been instructed by the US government not to invest its And also last month, we saw US stock exchanges targeting Chinese firms, saying that if they do not comply with American accounting standards, then they can no longer be listed on American stock exchange. So effectively, sort of both of these seek to try and deny Chinese firms access to American money or capital. Then the third front, I guess, is the one that's probably more familiar to most people because it's easier to report in the press, is Americans targeting specific firms and businesses. So Huawei, as we know, is the famous example. And I think for me, what's interesting was that, it's one thing for the US to be using its leverage within the financial system, which, to me is kind of a very sophisticated technique of using to target certain actors. But they've also begun to use what I would consider to be much more coarse or less sophisticated ways of doing that. And so this we saw a couple of months ago. With Huawei, at one point they were telling American firms not to sell semiconductor chips to Huawei. So Huawei could no longer buy semiconductor chips from American firms, but they could buy it from, say, a Taiwanese firm, for instance. And when that happened, American government decided, well, we're going to twist the and close the door a bit more. And now they're saying, well, they're not going to allow Huawei, any firm that uses American technology to produce semiconductor chips to sell to Huawei. So this means that these Taiwanese firms that previously could still sell the chips to Huawei now can't do that, because in order to produce those chips, they use machines that were made with American technology. So they're sort of shutting the door by and by to try and shut down Huawei. And then the other one that sort of started this month or last month, and that I'm sort of paying attention to, is this the targeting of TikTok, the social media app, alleging it for being a security risk to America and Americans. But either way, for me, I mean, what I look at this is, it seems to me that even, the way that they're targeting specific firms, one can't help but conclude that, the US and its allies like Australia have a strategy now where they're sort of trying to kill China, or at least kill Chinese firms, really, other than restrain them from restraining them from doing things that they don't like. Anyway, so as a result of these competition on these three fronts, this has sort of spawned a renewed interest in this notion of economic decoupling, right? Or the separation of the American economy from the Chinese economy, specific at one level, but at another level, sort of a separation from at the global economy between one side that sort of serves the US and then another side that serves China. And of course, this notion of decoupling has been compounded by the coronavirus crisis. And this has encouraged many people to, which also has led many people to sort of think about onshoring or reshoring of economic production, right? So the notion of decoupling and onshoring is now conflated into one big general debate about economic security. Now, the thing is this has not yet happened, or even though this trade war has started for a couple of years, and with now, the coronavirus crisis has sort of been progressing for a number of months. So the decoupling hasn't really happened, and it is quite unlikely to happen in a number of observers' views, including my own. So the question is, well, why? Well, one is that the Chinese market is just frankly too big and too economically attractive to, global firms. And so if you're running a business, you're effectively being, under this notion of decoupling, you're effectively being asked to choose between, the economy of the past, meaning the US, and the economy of the future, meaning China. And most firms just, would rather not choose, but if they had to, I suspect, they would try and accommodate China as much as they could. And we've seen this happening over and over again where, when they're forced to choose, many firms, including American firms, try not to alienate their Chinese consumers. The second reason why decoupling is not likely to happen is that the global production networks are frankly just too complex, right? The way goods of the modern economy is not simple. It requires actors from many countries. And so decoupling is just not reasonable, at least not at a very low and practical cost. And we'll come back to this shortly. So if outright decoupling wouldn't happen, well, what will we see? So here I'm going into a bit more of oh wait, sorry. Let me step back a bit on the why this would happen, right? So, so the Chinese economy is too big. The production networks are very complicated. The third reason is that a lot of global manufacturers claim that the Chinese production ecosystem is extremely difficult to replicate anywhere in the world. There's just a lot of suppliers, a lot of manufacturers, and a lot of skilled labor that can be apparently rallied at very short notice. And so if you were trying to produce efficiently, quickly for a big global consumer market, there is practically no other place in the world where that can be replicated. So unless you're willing to fall behind your competitors, you are not going to give that up quite easily. And the other argument is that China can produce in big volume. Very few other markets can. And we saw this as well when, at the height of the trade war, when some textile manufacturers tried to relocate production out of China to Southeast Asian nations. Many of them moved to Vietnam, but they couldn't relocate all their production there because Vietnam just could not manufacture the volume that China can to serve the global market. And then the other argument is that, well, it's very difficult and time-consuming and costly to set up a whole new manufacturing system in a lot of countries. In a new country, in a new location. So so many firms are sort of, in a sense, partially taking a wait-and-see approach because they're not willing to invest capital into a whole new production line unless they know this is going to be for the long term. And so that hasn't quite happened yet. Now, finally, if you think about it, many global firms, so although the US has introduced these tariffs on goods coming from China to the US, if you think about it, many global firms are not just manufacturing for the American market, they are manufacturing for a global market. So, the other countries have not raised, or not necessarily raised tariffs for goods coming from China. So for them, they might think, well, yes, the US is a big slice of the pie, but if that slice of the pie is declining over time, then maybe we could, it might be time to reorientate our business model. So if you took all of this, these points into consideration, you might think, ironically, a couple of other observers have thought about this. You might think that, ironically, the US might have, or might eventually inadvertently isolate itself from the global economy. So rather than isolate China, it might isolate itself because global businesses just unwilling to give up this very attractive Chinese market from both the production side as well as from the sales side, right? So what would happen? So I think what will happen is that we might get maybe a fragmentation, but an asymmetric one, or if you want to use the word decoupling, there might be a decoupling, but again, it might be asymmetric. And this will happen in the following way. So again, I'm sort of looking at trade, finance, and the firms. So on the trade side, we already kind of see this, that we will have sort of two-track production networks, or what some people call China plus one market, because it's so huge, and all other markets where, that don't raise tariffs on goods coming from China. And then another production line that will serve the US and any other country that, decides that they're going to raise barriers against goods coming from China. And Japan, the Japanese government has provided incentives, of money to its Japanese firms to try and help them diversify its production networks that way. We've seen some shifts in production to other countries, and the main beneficiaries have been Vietnam, India, Taiwan, Malaysia. So that could happen, but there are limits to how much this could happen. This might happen for simple manufacturing, things like textile production, clothing, fashion goods. It probably will happen for some key medical supplies as a result of what we're seeing from coronavirus. It probably will happen for people who want to serve the American market, and but it's unlikely to happen for a lot of other countries, because unless you have a market that's big enough for firms to try, sort of scale up to reach the economies of scale, they are unlikely to want to have multiple lines of production. And also, again, for the reasons that I've cited earlier, which is, they need inputs from many countries. So it's very hard to try and fragment, sort of reconfigure their production networks to try and serve multiple markets that are completely separated. The other point that many have also made is that whilst you want to try and manage that you might have from being exposed to the Chinese market, you also don't want to necessarily consolidate all this risk into one market, right? So for instance, it doesn't make sense for Apple, for instance, to produce all its products only from the US, in the US, or only in Japan. So what happens if you have like an earthquake in Japan and then suddenly your factories can't produce anymore? So the idea here for most firms is not necessarily onshoring or reshoring, but really rather managing risk and diversifying risk. And so for that reason, we will see probably a fragmentation, but not necessarily a full decoupling or a full onshoring. On the finance side, because China, Beijing is aware of its exposure to the leverage that the US has in the global financial system, it has started to try and develop its own payment systems so that it can avoid using the US dollars. So for instance, along the Belt and Road initiative, for a number of projects, China is trying as hard as it can to encourage its partner countries to use the Chinese renminbi rather than US dollar for financing and for loans. Now, it's going to take many observers will agree that this will take a very long time before China can be completely independent, or at least minimize its exposure to US dollar, because trying to encourage global business actors to use a different currency other than the US dollar takes quite a long time, and and China has to do a number of things, and that's probably not going to happen in the next 5 years, maybe in 10, but certainly not in the near future. The other thing on the finance side is investment, FDIs. Now, many have. If you look at the data, it's quite clear already that there has been a decline in Chinese investment into American economy in FDI, and also perhaps a number of other Western economies. Now, this has declined in the recent years in part because these Western economies have began to scrutinize investments coming from China more closely, right, for their links to government, and also trying to ensure that Chinese firms don't end up monopolizing certain industries and also sensitive national sectors. But the reverse hasn't happened. So American firms are still investing into China for very obvious reasons, because there is money to be made here. So here the asymmetry is most obvious, right? So Chinese firms are not going to US anymore, or perhaps not even to Western economies as much as they used to, but Western firms are still going into Chinese economy because of the future economic gains that can be had here. Now, finally on the third side, on how the US has been targeting specific firms like say TikTok and Huawei. Here, because it's still an ongoing issue, it's quite hard to sort of make any conclusion here, but I suspect in the long run, because of the increasing difficulties of doing business and investing in Western economies, some Chinese firms may ultimately just end up giving up, right? Why would you bother? There is enough money to be made within China itself. There's potentially quite a lot of money to be made in other economies other than the United States. So you might decide that this is, trying to break into American markets and like-minded markets might just be too much hard work. And so here you might end up having this fragmentation that's that's much more clear, where Chinese firms only exist in certain sectors of the global economy, certain parts of the global economy, and not others. So I sort of stop there here and look forward to some feedback and observations. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, so thank you, Dr. Lai, for excellent presentation. The next speaker is Dr. Daniel Bureau. Dr. Daniel will be speaking on role of middle power, especially Australia in the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Daniel is a lecturer in the global politics in the Justice and Society unit at the University of South Australia. Trained as a political scientist, he holds a PhD in politics and international relations from the Australian National University and Masters in International Relations and European Studies from the Central European University, and an MSc in Economics in Strategic Studies from University of Wales. His research interests include the theory and practice of state building in world politics, in particularly the role of non-state armed group, the issue of marginalization in global politics, with a focus on the agency of the so-called rough state, and grand strategy and middle powers. Dr. Daniel, you have around 20-25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, to Dr. Jaiswal for the invitation to join this panel, as well as to the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. It is really a pleasure to be part of those programs, as well as thank you to my colleagues that are joining me on this panel and all the audience. I'm going to, like my colleagues, I'm going to try to see if I can share my screen. And I think I managed. I have to warn that I am a little bit, I have a bad connection on the internet, so I hope it will work one way or another. Now, what I want to talk in this few minutes that I am allocated, I want to talk about the middle powers in the times of corona virus, right? So to look at what are the opportunities and challenges that middle powers might be exposed to in these times. So in terms of points that I want to touch upon, I want to first look at the COVID-19 pandemic as a critical juncture in middle power politics, so foreign policy of the middle powers, but also in terms of the middle power theorizing, right? So in what way the pandemic might lead to some changes in both theorizing and the practice of middle powers. I do want to make a caveat here in the sense that I'm looking at the critical juncture as a significant moment, not necessarily as a causal relation, right? So there's no point in saying that the COVID-19 is leading to particular transformation. I'm going to take the path that is most of the time taken in terms of the analyzing the impact of COVID, to look at the COVID as an accelerator or an intensifier of existing trends in many times. And those trends are looking at both global politics in terms of the superpower competition, the decline of international organization or the functioning of the international organizations, the decline of in general of the liberal international order and so on. But also in terms of amplifying and accelerating patterns or trends in domestic politics, and particularly, if you want, the decline in liberal democracy, and in many ways the rise of authoritarianism and the so-called illiberal democracy. In these terms, I want to explore those issues of the COVID-19 as a potential critical juncture. Second point that I would want to touch upon is referring to the changing context for the middle power actions in terms of kind of lessons learned so far from COVID-19. And in this sense, issues such as the fact that Asia in general performed, at least so far, better than either Western Europe or the Americas as a whole, including North America and Canada. Second context is that the pandemic led to a response that is primordially national rather than either regional or in a global coordinated way. We might see changes in this pattern, but so far it seems to be that the level of action is pretty much individually at the level of the nation state. With this, we reach another point in terms of the context, and that is referring to the global institution and multilateralism in the times of Corona. And again, we see a decline in the functioning of the global institutions and multilateralism, partially dictated by this preference for individual national responses. I will touch upon the idea of the COVID demonstrating some irresponsibility on the side of the superpowers, both China and United States. And finally, I will end with some, in a way, paradoxical conclusion in the sense of COVID-19 leading to a consensus, in a way, about the dysfunctionality of the current world order and the need to engage with changing this international order. Although, of course, while there is a consensus that something has to change, reform, there is a strong disagreement in terms of what change means, right? And we already, Pichamon mentioned the idea of revisionism versus status quo and so on. The fourth point that I want to touch upon touches upon the idea of where do those changes leave middle powers, right? So I'm going to offer a kind of a continuum of scenarios, if you want, from optimism in regard to the role of middle powers in the sense that of COVID-19 crisis and the withdrawal in many ways of the US from the international order, or refusal or difficulties in carrying the burden of supporting the international order, creating a space, if you want, for the middle powers to occupy at the one end of the continuum, with the other end of the continuum being occupied by some pessimism in terms of the capacity of the middle powers in a changed international environment to actually act or to continue to act in a particular way. I will leave that intentionally, I would leave that issue in a format of questions rather than particular answers. So I'm apologizing for those who would have looked for answers or predictions, if you want, in terms of the role of the middle powers. So COVID-19 in global politics came obviously as a shock. Not only as a shock in one dimension, but actually at a multidimensional shock to individuals, to societies, to health systems in general, economies, governments, and international organizations. Reactions to the pandemics, particularly governmental decisions to cope with the virus, especially lockdowns, for instance, are very likely to have long-term consequences. If we talk about lockdowns, of course, we talk about particular economic impact of a global recession that GCON has already touched upon, or the risks of a recession, to a level that the world haven't seen in quite some time. Losses of jobs, unprecedented both in scale, but also in speed with which they came about. The progress made at the global level in terms of tackling poverty in the last decades is under risk, and we already seen some return to the levels of poverty of some decades ago. Of course, an important issue for middle powers, as well as for great or superpowers, is the level of national debt, right? So the particularly developed countries were able to, and most of them have invested in huge amount of resources to try to save economies, not national economies, from the pandemic. But they will obviously throw a large shadow on future development, and it will constrain in many ways the capacity of international actors to act collectively, right, or to bear the costs of proposing new initiatives. What's happening? This is not from me. Second, in terms of the pandemic, as I said, is acting as an accelerator of trends, particularly in terms of accelerating great power ideological competition on the one hand, which might lead, if you want, to a kind of a return to some sort of a Hobbesian competition in many ways, right? Particularly as states, great powers or otherwise, become more competitive and less cooperative. The incentives to shape the world in the state's own narrow interest is becoming more acute. More positively, COVID-19 is speculated to also act as an interrupter, right? So of particular patterns, and I have in mind here the fact that populist wave might be arrested in some way by the crisis. In terms of international cooperation, there are various scenarios putting forward, either something similar to what in the 1990s Kaplan presented as a coming anarchy, or the chances for some fresh beginnings. Of course, there is a risk that we will fall back into a new tribalism, if you want, again focused inward in terms of policies rather than outward, in a manner that will exacerbate discrimination at home. We've already seen cases in various parts of the world, including the United States and China, but also India to a high degree, and an exacerbation of nationalism, if you want, which will again make international cooperation much more difficult. So I apologize. So in many ways, there is a danger of a revival of trinity, right? Revival of power politic, return of the state, so state centrism, and extreme nationalism. But on the other hand, pandemic could be an opportunity, right? And Gare Woods is making the point that the world is not in the first crisis that it solved, and gives the example of the creation of the international world order in the wake of the Second World War, right? And she's pointing out that there are some parallel in terms of kind of three attributes that will have to be taken care of, and that will be obviously to fight the common enemy, fascism and Nazism in the Second World War, but now the virus. But the idea is of this fight to take place collectively rather than individually, right? So second will be the idea of political and geopolitical understanding in many ways, a kind of a plan to accommodate individual political system and therefore diversity, and to find a way to actually maintain this diversity. And finally, of course, and Jikon might the economic task of recovering, right, from the depression that the COVID has thrown the entire world into. Patrick Stewart, in terms of this fresh beginning, was saying that in terms of restructuring, resurrecting international cooperation, there will be needed at least again. The idea of Trinity seems to actually dominate all the major thinking about the New World Order. But there will be the requirement of new thinking, right? So new ideas to respond to or to repudiate the hyper-nationalism, protectionism, and populism. Enlightened leadership, which it might seem like lacking at the moment, at least in terms of the superpowers, right? As well as a favorable distribution of power. And it's not clear what a favorable distribution of power might mean, right? And here is the debate in realist terms of what kind of polarity of the system is more more stable. In terms of the middle power, there are several changes in the context in which middle powers can act. At a regional power, at the regional level, it is obvious that, at least for now, Asian countries seems to have performed much better than Western Europe and the Americas. Of course, I'm saying that with a little bit of a caveat. There is a huge diversity in the responses, and Asia-Pacific nations, like globally, have had a range of experiences tackling the virus. Some clearly more successful than the others. But an important element that I would like to emphasize is that categories such as democratic or authoritarian, rich versus poor, big or small, don't seem to actually make a difference in terms of a direct causal relation to the quality of the response given to the crisis. The contrast doesn't seem to be between ideologies, democracies, and authoritarianism or autocracy, as much as it is between state capacity, right, and the quality of leadership, as well as, very important, the citizen trust in the government. As I mentioned already, the COVID has marked a return, or actually accelerated a return to the state centrism, right, and state responses to the crisis, to the detriment, if you want, of multilateral responses. For all the importance of the ASEAN-centered architecture, or groups like East Asia Summit, APEC, even the WHO or United Nations, those institutions seems to be kind of absent in action in terms of the crisis. An important element that we have to keep in mind, and I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answer section, is the acceleration of the democracy's decline. This is, again, not a factor that is produced by the COVID crisis, but it is something that existed for the last, if you want, about 15 years, right? If you follow the Freedom House reports on decline of democracies, you've seen quite an accelerated decline in democracies. We see that also affecting Asia-Pacific in various forms, but there seems to be an illiberal turn in South Asia, affecting various countries, right? From the crackdowns on political opposition in Cambodia to the constitutional reform to consolidate military influence in various governments, not the least Thailand or Philippines. Increasing violence in some countries, including again Philippines and other areas. There are other trends that are quite dangerous in terms of the rule of law in many countries, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally. And we can talk about Poland or other countries in a part of the world. The use of courts, or in many ways the diminishment of the independence of the court, at least for this period, is another worrying trend. And finally, there is, of course, the appearance of the superpowers as irresponsible actors in the international governance, right? America's response is defined as incoherent and erratic at the best case, right? Long delayed denial and incoherence in the response to the crisis. Beijing hasn't yet demonstrated any more leadership, right? At least not harnessing multilateral institutions for pandemic management. After some clumsy initial steps, China moved aggressively to lock cities and regions in what seemed to be a successful policies. But again, it's starting to be, its soft power offensive seems to be relatively limited, diminished in appeal as time passes by. We can talk more about that in terms of, and it is talked in the scholarly debates as a kind of a presence of a G0 world, eviscerated from the participation of superpowers as leaders in the global management or in the global governance. Now, this is very interestingly also noticed in the perceptions in terms of the middle powers, and there are various opinion polls in those countries regarding attitudes towards China and the United States. Malcolm Cook recently has made the point that in at least 3 countries, and he has in mind Australia, Canada, and Germany, there is a consistent disappointment and diminished trust with both the United States and China. Seems to converge this kind of distrust, right? China perceived as increasingly assertive, if not aggressive, and US perceived as kind of incompetent or lacking the will to intervene on a kind of a global scale. Now, those kind of results are replicated across many other countries, and there are many other instruments to demonstrate that. In the span of 4 months, public opinion has quickly shifted in France, Germany, and the US on the topic of geopolitics, and particularly the rise of China. And that can be seen in some of the statistics I put on the PowerPoint, right? So if we look at the transatlantic trends, both before and during the coronavirus, we've seen actually a decline in the belief of the US as the most influential actor in global affairs in Germany, France, and US itself, and a corresponding increase actually in the perception of China as being an increasingly influential actor. We see the same in terms of the China's rising influence in global affairs, and particularly a perception of negative attitude towards towards China's rise and West. Again, the same result is kind of replicated in Southeast Asia, and in the 2020 State of Southeast Asia survey published in January of this year, we see some interesting trends in terms of the trust in both China and Asia. But what is important is that most of the countries in ASEAN are actually considering China most political and strategic power in the region. So that will have some impact in terms of the positions that particular countries might take in the eventuality of being forced to choose between one or another, which in Asian countries are trying to obviously avoid. Again, in terms of championing the international leadership, you're going to see that middle powers have, such as Australia or New Zealand, have a relatively limited influence or positive perception in the ASEAN countries. Japan, on the other hand, and European Union are being seen as the countries that are most influential or more, in a way, benevolent influencers in the region. This leads to the paradoxical consensus between the opponents and supporters of the international liberal order in terms of the need for reformation of an increasingly dysfunctional order. Of course, it is disagreement regarding the solution between supporters that are looking at a reform of the current and existing international order versus opponents which are looking at revising or changing the international order altogether. Now, in terms of the conceptual, and I'm not going to insist too much on this dimension, both the concept of middle powers and Indo-Pacific remaining what it is called a contested concept. It is important to keep in mind that both of those concepts are political concepts, right? They are neither value-free nor purely descriptive, and as such, they are serving particular interests. In terms of the middle power, and I will let Pichamon talk more about Indo-Pacific, although she touched already on most of those issues. It is an issue of membership membership of the category, right? Who is a middle power? Who is not a middle power? What are the characteristic behaviors of the middle powers? And here there is a distinction between the so-called traditional or old middle power versus emerging middle power. What is the characteristic function of in the system, right? That of followership, of stabilizers, and so on. And what is the relationship with superpowers? Again, we can look on various indexes of powers. All of them are rather limited, but one of the often quoted index is that of Global Firepower Report or the Lowy Institute Asia Power. And Lowy Institute, for those of you who are not familiar, is a very interesting resource trying to organize a kind of a hierarchy of powers in Asia across a number of dimensions, right? 8 indicators of power. It's one of the most complex index of power, and therefore strongly recommended with all its limitations. But what is important is that in the last index published last year, it seems that most of the middle powers, which are defined in a kind of a quantitative way in the region, and you might find some surprising presences here, right? Russia defined as a middle power according to those indexes, but most of them have increased in power, maybe with the exception of Taiwan. Some countries obviously are using their resources better, and that's the right side column, while in the green color and others are performing less good in terms of efficiency of their use of resources. It is important to keep in mind that conceptually, of course, the concept of middle power is less popular than that of great power or superpowers, although some scholars are claiming kind of a potential long pedigree. But in terms of the modern use of the term, the concept is used, and that's important because it emphasizes the political nature of it. At the end of the Second World War, in the discussions about the post-World War order, with Canada and Australia being the main carriers of the concept, through which they were trying to achieve a better position at the decision table, right? Now, there are different definitional approaches to what constitute a middle power, and that kind of moves from quantifiable approaches, right? Either the positional approach, which tries to create a hierarchy of states according to their material sources of power, right? So the identification of certain characteristics, size of territory, and so on, but also economic, human capital, and also issues of values and trust, to a more identity-based approach, right? Taking into account the claims of political leaders on middle power status. Those would be the two more easily quantifiable approaches, also the least complex. More complex approaches to definitions of middle powers include behavioral approaches, and here there is the famous definition of Cooper, Higgott, and Nossel, that are looking at the tendency of middle states to pursue multilateral solutions to international problems, tendency to embrace compromise positions in international disputes, and tendency to embrace notions of good international citizenship, right? And the other approaches that are also complex are looking at the functional approaches, what functions the middle power serves in the international system, and particular things such as, for instance, regulation and management of conflict, maintaining stability and prevention of violence, think about peacekeeping, as well as good citizenship, including the capacity to boost development, right? So contribution to developmental aid. More recently, Andrew Carr from ANU has proposed a more systemic approach that is looking both at the capacity of the countries to defend its vital national interests, right? So sovereignty, but at the same time to significantly influence the main parameters of the existing world order. There are various waves and attempts to organize a typology of the middle powers, including a chronological, if you want, but also with the elements of behavioral characteristics, distinction between the old or traditional middle powers, including Australia, Canada, Scandinavian countries, and Benelux in various interpretations, versus new middle powers, right, or emerging middle powers, with the first category, then of the traditional middle powers, looking or sharing characteristics such as identifying niche diplomacy, peace building, multilateralism, functions of mediation or bridge building, facilitations, and the like. While emerging middle powers will be less attached in a way to those values, and in many ways more, not necessarily opportunistic, but more pragmatic in many ways, including in relations to other poles of international politics, as well as the reformation in many ways of the system. Of course, if they are emerging or rising powers, they would have an interest into not only the status quo, but a reformation in particular direction of the international system. Another typology refers to the relative autonomy of those middle powers, with Alan Patience from Melbourne discussing the categories of dependent middle powers or regional middle powers, which he excludes as being kind of a false middle powers because of reliance on the superpower, versus the so-called real middle powers, states that possess little or no military threat to neighbors and respective regions, but also have a leadership influence as well as some ethical stance in the international affairs. More recently, Swiland introduces a different conceptualization of middle powers in terms of typology, starting from Alexander Venn's concept of cultures of anarchy, pointing out the existence of some Hobbesian middle powers that perceive the regional and systemic structure and anarchic and base their policy on power politics, pessimism, security, and the like, versus Lockean middle powers that identify the regional or systemic structure as less anarchic and priority of a mix between high and low politics, versus Kantian middle powers, which interpret the anarchic world in a more positive way, emphasizing the low politics, and thus greater importance of the bridge building and cooperation or mediating functions. Now, where does that leave us in terms of the future for the middle power? Now, it is important to keep in mind that in the future, as in the present, the action of the middle power are conditioned, if you want, at two levels. Both internationally, the systemic structure configuration will influence the constraints and opportunities for all states, including middle powers. While domestic politics and thus the impact, if you want, of a decline of democratization, for instance, underwrite also the foreign policy of the middle powers. Now, some people, looking particularly at the performance of some middle power in the pandemic crisis, are tempted to announce, if you want, at least the possibility of a new middle power momentum. If you look at the successful cases, if you want, in dealing with pandemic, names of countries such as South Korea, Japan, Singapore, at least for a while, or outside of the region, Germany, New Zealand, as well as Australia coming back to the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific region. They are all pointed out as kind of models and success. Of course, we do realize that now it's kind of a second wave happening and all those countries are affected to a higher or lower degree. Less prominent in media, but worthy mentioning is the case of Vietnam, right? Representing one of the most successful cases, at least up to this point, as well as obviously Taiwan. It must be said, though, that not all middle powers have enjoyed such successes. If we look at the South American cases, countries such as Brazil, but also Mexico, Peru, Chile, and even Argentina have kind of quite high numbers and quite lacking success so far in dealing with the pandemic. Turkey, Canada, and Sweden. At least for Sweden, the dice is still rolling. But Turkey and Canada, again, are hardly a success story in dealing with the pandemics. In the region of Asia Pacific, India and Pakistan, but also Indonesia and Philippines find quite difficult dealing with the pandemic. However, for those scholars tempted to look at the possibility of an increase in the role of middle powers, the outbreak of COVID may have precipitated some structural power shift, if you want, in world politics, necessary to make middle power more important stakeholders in global decision making, particularly thinking about the withdrawal or irresponsibility of the superpowers themselves. However, there is a limit on what what middle powers, for instance, can do. It is obviously that during the crisis, for instance, countries such as France and Germany have initiated some collective answers to the pandemic, particularly in terms of the international financial response, with relatively limited success. Some success in terms of the announced debt cancelling or debt reduction of the developing countries, although it's still to be seen if those promises will be indeed fulfilled. There is also another scenario that is pointing out to a sunset of at least the traditional middle powership, and various scholars are looking at a more pessimistic view in that sense. For instance, Jeffrey Robertson or Andrew Carr are pointing out to the fact that the activism, particularly in terms of traditional activism and emphasis on particular values and good citizenship that middle powers has practiced during the Cold War, but also in the post-Cold War era, might have been muted by a refocus in a way on security and increase insecurity both in the region but also at the global level, right? So less value-oriented and more interest-oriented middle powers might have a more muted action or capacity of acting at the international level. In that sense, Nina Gregor is also mentioning the fact that in the emerging contestation of power between the United States and China, there is a risk of challenging middle powers traditional sheltering policies, right? So the cover that allowed middle powers to actually have an active role in international system. In terms of Australia, and I'm not going to touch upon that too large in the presentation, there seemed to be a tension between its interest and policies in various parts of the area, right? So it seems that the interests and policies of the Australia in Southeast Asia, and particularly in relation to ASEAN, are not exactly aligned with the policies that Australia is pursuing in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the militarization of the Quad, as well as probably a tension with the actions in Pacific. I will probably stop here, just because I'm aware of the time passing by, but hopefully we have some time for questions and answers.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. We have got lots of questions, so and we're also running out of time, so I'll rush to the questions because we are flooded with questions, and I think we hardly have 20 minutes. So let me start with a first set of questions. The first question is for Dr. Lai. There are talks of decoupling between US and China. How is it going to impact the global economy and US-China relations? So that is the first question to Dr. Lai. And first question for Daniel is, there are lots of questions very similar, and I'm going to club together. There are three questions that I've clubbed together for Daniel is, where do ASEAN, or you can say Southeast Asian countries, stand on the issue of Indo-Pacific? Another question is, what will be the impact of the US-China rivalry on Indo-Pacific region? And third is, are there many BRI projects in Australia? Is Indo-Pacific going to impact China's Belt and Road Initiative? And if yes, how? So that is for Daniel. And third question is for Pichamon. Which country is posing threat to other, China to US or US to China? In regard to this competition in Indo-Pacific, please tell how the countries in the region, including Quad Plus, can lessen this practically instead of provocations. So these are the three questions for all the panelists. Please respond, and then we'll come to next set of questions. Maybe you can start with Pichamon.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's an interesting one. I would say that both countries pose a threat to each other if we look at the current state of affairs. But I think at the end of the day, each country poses the greatest threat to itself. So I think what we've seen in the US with the domestic turmoil, also with Trump's inconsistent foreign policy and domestic policy, is the fact that if the US wants to safeguard its own interests, it really needs to first come up with a consistent policy as well as a comprehensive strategy where its end goals are clear. At the same time, for China, with the wolf warrior situation, it's clear that Beijing also needs to rein in some of the hardline stances that are being espoused as well. And this is important not just only to kind of China's international reputation, but also to alleviating concerns of that China threat. So ultimately, I think it's a question of not which country poses a threat to the other, but also how they themselves can exacerbate the situation. So in terms of how the countries in the region can practically lessen this, I think at the end of the day, I still believe in engagement, and I think it's important to maintain engagement with either country, especially now with the kind of the China threat thesis kind of resurfacing yet again. I think it's all the more important that countries in the region, ASEAN countries, Australia included, and in South Asia, focus on engaging with China. It's always easier said than done, but I think it's important that countries steer away from provocations. It's important that there is that continued focus on collective security, especially given the collective impacts of COVID-19. And I think it's important that the focus be not just on the discord that we're seeing, but on identifying avenues for collaboration. So I'll stop there. But thank you again for the question.
Dr. Lai, maybe you'd like to respond.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll be quick because I'm generally not very fond of speculating about the future. I think the short answer to that question is that the bigger threat to the global economy is probably the current health crisis rather than the US-China war. But that said, as I probably intimated in my presentation, in the midst of this fight between the US and China, there is certainly going to be opportunity for small and middle power or middle income countries, right? So, many people have already noted that in the last year or so, Vietnam's exports to the US has risen by about 30 to 40% as a result of the diversion of trade from China to the US to Vietnam and the US. And also there's been reports that Apple, for instance, is shifting some of its production of devices to India from China as as a way of managing the risks from the US-China trade war. So I think for smaller countries, the opportunity here is to try and capture some of this diversion, to make sure that you've in the event that you really do want to get more of this money, economic activity, then to ensure that you've got the right economic environment or framework for foreign investors to come in and play, I suppose. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Daniel?
Yes, I'm not exactly sure I will remember all the questions, but I did take some notes in terms of the ASEAN perspective of the Indo-Pacific. Look, until very recently, ASEAN as a whole was not very much attached to the concept of the Indo-Pacific. I don't want to say rejected, but it was not that enthusiastic on the concept, right? And that's particularly because in many circles, Indo-Pacific could be seen as an instrument to balance or as an alternative, if you want, to China, push forward by particularly United States. There is very little interest in ASEAN to gang in some ways in this balancing mechanism. However, last year, ASEAN as a whole released a document called Outlook on the Indo-Pacific in June last year, and that is, as Pichamon already mentioned, can be seen as a reply to the American administration intention to kind of securitized in many ways the Indo-Pacific terminology in the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, right? Now, within these parameters, right, so initial reluctance to the terminology was kind of seen as a competitive term or well, terminology of strategy to the ASEANs, right? So if you see it in terms of a zero-sum game, of course you will be reluctant to play an important role into it. But in the outlook on the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN defines Indo-Pacific less as a territorially clearly delineated or geopolitical space, right? But rather as a kind of an interdependent, closely linked region without clearly defining its border. And of course, in the outlook in the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN is placed at its center, reflecting the core principles of the ASEAN, including deepening of regional integration, peaceful conflict resolution, maintenance of a rule-based regional order, multilateralism, strengthening international law, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be a kind of an attempt to the question on how ASEAN is seeing the Indo-Pacific, right? So partially as a competitor, partially trying to reform or to present an alternative vision on Indo-Pacific.
Let's go to second round of question, and since we are running out of time, this should be the last round. These questions are not directed to anyone, so anyone can question. Maybe all of you can give brief comment. First is, do you think that in post-COVID era, Quad plus countries might go for a kind of conflict? That is one. Like, what is the possibility of Quad versus China, kind of conflict that might emerge post-COVID? That is one. Second, how do you look at the role of Australia in Indo-Pacific strategy, given the deep economic engagement of all the Quad member countries with China? What is the future of Indo-Pacific strategy, and what is the role of Australia? This is second. Third is, what is the nature, will the nature of US-China rivalry be more confrontational post-COVID-19? It's almost very similar to the first question. And another is, America has always been saying that Indo-Pacific is not aimed at anyone, hinting that China, it's not aimed at China. It is a rule-based approach for free and fair Indo-Pacific. What do you think about Indo-Pacific? Do you think it's not aimed at China? So maybe Pichamon?
Sure, I'll start with the last question first. I think it's of course it's diplomatically important to say that the free and open Indo-Pacific concept is not aimed at China, but I think the reality is that it is aimed at China. I mean, Australia came up with a similar Pacific step-up strategy, and Canberra made it clear that it was not aimed at China, but really it was a lot about China, and it was meant to counter perceived Chinese influence in the Pacific region, for example. So I think that example, I think, demonstrates how, you know, there's that disjuncture perhaps between what's said diplomatically and what the reality is, which links to my response, I guess, to the first and the second question in terms of how can we then prevent conflict from occurring, if I've understood the questions correctly, from happening between the Quad countries and China and to kind of ensure that this Indo-Pacific concept is put to good use. That conflict would costly to both parties, certainly even in the case of India versus China over the border disputes right now, it's clear that India would stand to lose economically from kinetic conflict with China, and likewise stand to lose as well. And that's in one sense, that's the beauty of economic interdependence, right? It means that kinetic conflict is much more costlier, and therefore governments would need to become much more wary of instigating such conflict in the first place. So I think in one sense, the current international system has a preventative mechanism inbuilt already in that form of economic interdependence. I think it's more a question of how countries in the international community can better leverage the opportunities that are then offered. I think so much, again, of the focus right now is on the conflict tensions that have emerged as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but less is being said about the opportunities that exist and how countries can actually leverage those opportunities, whether it be to encourage more cooperation on health or medical issues, but also how, rectifying the kind of over-reliance on the single market in current global supply chains, how that can be done, and how it can better benefit developing countries, especially in the ASEAN region as well as in South Asia. So I think that's the issue. I think we need to reorient our focus away from the discord and more shift it more towards the collaboration opportunities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Daniel, maybe would you like to respond?
I'm muted.
Oh,
I'm muted. I'm back. Unmuted. Agree with most of what Pichamon has put there. I think it is important to keep in mind that the conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific is very diverse, first of all, right? But in all the conceptualization, and I have a map. I'm not sure if I can share it again. Let me see if I can share again the screen. I'm not sure if it is very clear from here, but there is a map of different conceptualization of different countries of the Indo-Pacific, and there are different countries that are expressly not part of it, right? So in for instance, Indian conceptualization, or for that matter, Australian efforts are being taken, for instance, to keep Russia out of that area. But in all of them, China is actually part of, right? So that actually brings back the issue that China is part of the region, and without China, the region would look very differently. So this interdependence or interconnectivity plays a deterrent role. Now, in terms of the Quad, ideally, the Quad remains a deterrent instrument, right? So ideally, none of those countries part of the Quad, and not all of the countries are a member of the Quad in the same or to the same degree, right? So Australia, even today, remains excluded, for instance, from the military exercises such as Malabar. But I think that all countries in this Quad or reinvented Quad have an interest to actually avoid war. So in any case, I would see it as a deterrent, if anything. I do think that one instrument, and again, Pichamon touched upon this issue, it's worth remembering that despite the military or high security, if you want, functions that the Quad seems to take in most of the perceptions in the media, the origins of the Quad were much less bellicose in many ways. So it was formed in the wake of the 2004 tsunami as an informal forum of cooperation to respond to those disasters. I think that a more emphasis on this dimension might also play a role into the detensioning, if you want, of some of the tensions in the region. And I could stop here to give a chance maybe to Jikon to have a say.
Yes, Dr. Lai, maybe you would like to comment on it.
it's a very short one. I guess the idealist in me would like to see the world the way that Pichamon outlined, because our economies are so interdependent that we would not risk a war, to lose everything by going to war. I think the problem for me is that if you've been following Australian politics in the last 6 months, you can't help but conclude that the politicians in Australia seem very happy to sacrifice the economic future of Australia just to have pig fights with China. So the economic interdependence might not really matter all that much. However, on a brighter note, the good thing about democracies like Australia and the US is that because a lot of the antagonisms between China and these countries come from the leaders, you just have to wait for the next round of elections. So, the US will have elections in 6 months' time, well, less than that actually, and Australia will have another election in a year and a half. You will have, and maybe we'll have a different set of political dynamics after all. So fingers crossed.
That's a lot to that's a lot of expectations for changes as a result of elections. So, but yeah.
Okay. Dr. Pichamon, Dr. Daniel, and Dr. Lai, thank you very much for your time and wonderful presentation. It was a very comprehensive presentation, and therefore we did not ask you to stop, because though we know that we are running out of time, because we want to listen more on these issues, we hardly get to hear these perspectives here in Nepal. So once again, we'd like to thank you for your valuable time. We'd also like to thank all our wonderful participants for their questions. Thank you so much. We hope to see you tomorrow's webinar on radicalization in Pakistan by Aisha Siddiqui at 3 p.m. Nepal time. See you tomorrow. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very